relief for everybody today as the VO65s and the Imoca 60s are all now moving in what appears to be decent breeze, or at least for the moment, on day 3 of the final offshore leg of the Ocean Race Europe. But there's been some place changes, and certainly we're lining up for a little bit of fraught action in the final few miles. So in order to outline exactly what's happened, we need to have a look at how we've got there. So let's wind the clock back to sunset yesterday, and let's go to the Imoca 60s, who at this point were still pretty frustrated to find themselves in this light wind situation. On board all the teams, life was just a game of patience, not least for Coram.
Qu'est-ce qui se passe, Benj?
Bah écoute, on est en calaminé là. On pensait toucher un petit peu de pression, enfin en tout cas tu m'avais vendu qu'il y avait un petit peu de pression qui arrivait.
A lot of patience required then for all the teams as well as Coram. But the one thing is, it's certainly easier to switch off and rest your mind when it is light like this.
Qu'est-ce qui se passe?
Bonjour, bonjour. 3e matin à bord de Bureau Vallée. Et on se réveille avec un joli brouillard. Voilà. On ne voit pas grand chose. C'est très humide. Très humide. Voilà. C'est le patron qui fait la navigation. Alors le patron, comment ça se passe?
C'est humide. C'est humide, mais le vent est arrivé enfin.
Le vent est arrivé, ouais. C'était pas folichon cette nuit, hein. Ça a un peu fait flop-flop. Allez, je vous montre comment c'est dehors. C'est tout gris. On se croirait en Angleterre.
A foggy morning, but at least a new day meant a new forecast and a new chance to try and find some breeze. And with all of the Imoca 60s packed so closely together, seconds wasted in getting the boat set up or onto the right course could be a serious blow to any hard-fought miles that you've built up the day before. On board 11th Hour Racing, they were making sure nothing was left unnoticed.
Mass rotations at 28, yeah.
So when it's really light, what is really important is never stop. Because after to build all the speed of the heavy boat like an Imoca is complicated. And you have to be cool because it's light until the end. And we don't know when we are going to arrive. Next week, next month, next year maybe.
I'm on the top, inside the bottom, outside the bottom, I should say. Wind is really twisted.
Now this is a little bit of a chance to see how 11th Hour Racing and all the crews are setting up and steering to their sails. Anybody that sailed a dinghy will be used to steering to the tailtails. The problem is these boats are so tall, you've not got 1, 2 or 3 rows of tailtails, you've got multiple. And because the wind is different from the top to the bottom and in the middle, and you can twist and trim your sail as if it was 1, 2 or 3 sails stacked on top of each other. The sail, depending on whether you're looking at the bottom or at the top, could be telling you to either harden up, bear away, or keep your course. So Charlie Enright there, who's on the helm, is just feeding that to Pascal Badigary to leeward, probably trimming the jib, just trying to get the jib happy all the way up from the bottom, twisting it, bringing it back in line so that all of the sail is working as efficiently as possible. And you heard them earlier just talking about whether they were going to put water ballast into the front of the boat to try and trim the nose down a little bit, whether they were happy with the mast rotation. There's so many things to concentrate on this boat beyond simply, is the sail flapping, shall we pull it in? And even when you've got to grips with these boats, then you need to start taking a rest, then you need to start going around that trimming loop again. This is why we see the autopilots on board these craft. The trouble is, for conditions like we're seeing, it's a difficult game to rely on the autopilots.
You know, the autopilot does a great job when conditions are stable, when the wind gear is telling the truth. But in this instance, the wind's coming from everywhere. It's really twisted, so it's easier to hand steer. Yes. The derivative, the rate of change in light air is a lot higher than, say, the Southern Ocean, when you can be on the same tack or jibe for days at a time. And we've done more maneuvers in this leg probably than we have in the rest of the race combined already, so it's really tricky and you got to stay on your game.
Large amounts of concentration required for anybody on board these boats, whether you're holding onto the tiller, whether you've got a sheet, or indeed any of the sail controls. But the good thing is that the breeze did start to build throughout the morning. And for the Imoca 60s, with an awful lot of miles to make before they caught up with Offshore Team Germany, if indeed that was ever going to be possible, it was all about keeping the boat moving. The trouble was that the breeze was pretty localized, so deciding on where to go was critical. Coming into the coast, coming out, and that meant more and more maneuvers. That was all resting on the shoulders of the navigator. And on board 11th Hour Racing Team, that meant Simon Fisher being called up on deck to constantly give an update.
What about 10 out from attack?
What's the water status?
Huh?
Water?
In the boat? Empty. We're going along the north shore, and obviously the wind's got to go up and over the shore, so if you get in too close it gets a bit lighter, so we're just trying our best to sort of hold off and get back to the gradient. But it looks like we've got another tack coming up in about 10. So after about 1,000 tacks around the island, we've probably got a few more.
Well, the good news is, in the light winds and with this flat water, tacking in a Imoca 60 is not as hard as it sometimes is. The boat was able to be thrown around from port to starboard, from starboard to port, and the battle could commence between Buer Valet and 11th Hour Racing Team for first place in this pack of 4 Imocas to the south. And it was all about positioning yourself to the short line and knowing when to come out and when, as Simon Fisher was telling us, to dive back in close up to the islands. For the whole fleet, as they started to trade manoeuvres and find themselves with a little bit more space to play with, we saw a big split in that group of 4, with Buer Valet and 11th Hour Racing sticking neck and neck, and then ultimately deciding to go either way off the eastern side of the island. 11th Hour Racing Team decided to tack over and start making their way to the northwest, with Buer Valet heading out to the northeast. On the western side was Coram, and then going around the other side of the island, Linked Out started to pop out and seriously challenge Buer Valet for control of that right-hand side. All 4 of these Imoca 60s now spreading out across east and west and try to close down on the boat that was a long way ahead. Offshore Team Germany had got themselves into an incredibly impressive lead early on in this leg, and they didn't show any signs of giving it up. In fact, they had their minds on much more pressing matters.
Ben,
Yeah,
you as a French person sailing for a German team,
yeah.
tell me a little bit about your feelings towards the football match tonight, Germany-France. Who is going to win tonight?
France for sure. We will win with the German team the race now, and after we will win the match with the France for sure.
France wins,
Yeah?
For sure.
then we have a happy navigator. It's also good for us. Happy navigators, always good.
And it was a happy navigator indeed, not just for the football result, not just for the company that Offshore Team Germany and some of our other teams have had out on the water with the wildlife in the Mediterranean, but also because the performance of this team stayed where they needed it to be. They were managing to push 85 miles at times ahead of their nearest rivals, and keeping themselves that far ahead meant keeping themselves in the best of the breeze. Well, that was the battle in the Imoca 60s that's still very much raging at the moment. But what about the VO 65s? There hasn't been that much of a split between first and the rest of the group. Indeed, Sailing Poland, who, when we left yesterday, were in the lead, had a little bit of a tricky night, sailing into a few holes. But when the sun came up and the navigator, Axel, came up on deck, it was good news that he was delivering to the crew.
18 miles, we're free. They're still stuck, yeah. Waiting for the rest of the bunch.
With a solid lead over Murpuri Foundation Racing Team, Sailing Poland were looking confident to keep pushing. In second place, Murapuri Foundation Racing Team were probably more concerned about the boats behind them. Axonabel Ocean Racing only a little way behind, and then out to the east, Viva Mexico, along with Amber Sail 2 and the Austrian Ocean Race Project. The interesting boat was the one furthest inshore. This was Childhood One, and they were hell-bent on getting themselves closest to the shore to exploit the best of the sea breeze. It was a manoeuvre that started to pay off, and they really closed down on the boats ahead, and you can see just how confident they are about what's to come.
We just passed here and on our way to Saint-Tropez, playing the coastline a little bit. We got some favorite left breeze, so we're quite happy, I think, at the moment. Yeah, but still a long way to go, still 114 miles to go, so we're not in Genoa yet, but we're happy. Happy people from the Childhood One.
The big question for Childhood One was, can they turn this lead into something a little bit more solid? Can they get between their rivals and the mark? And while they kept ducking inshore to get the sea breeze that was building throughout the day, they knew they needed to come out. When the sea breeze kicked and they got that big push out, it was a narrow cross, but it was in their favour. Childhood One set themselves up in second place. Sailing Poland hold on to first place for now, and the finish line at Genoa is coming into sight. But the leaders aren't leaving anything to chance. At one point, they were sending crew member Kasper Gajauch over the side to check to see whether they picked up any seaweed or any rubbish on their keel and on their dagger boards. Something that, if it went unnoticed, could seriously hamper their chances of a leg victory here into Genoa. But it wasn't just going to be about what might happen underneath the water. The big question was what was going to happen to the breeze. And for Sailing Poland in the lead, they had to think very carefully about their strategy because the boats behind were planning theirs.
We're sailing along the French coast at the moment, which is about 10 miles to Leeuwarden. We can't see it. We know down there is Cannes and Monaco and Champagne and caviar. Here we're still on free stride and salty water. But that's okay, because it looks like we're going to be into Genoa tomorrow morning. So, here we go.
The field has compressed again, so Axe is right in front of us. Just a few miles in front of our bow, and then Amber Sail is right next to us. And then we see some boats on the horizon, which is hard to identify who's who. But it might be the Mexicans all the way east, and then up north is Murapuri. And we might have seen Sailing Poland as well, but they're in the lead, so it's maybe unlikely. That there's also a lot of traffic here, so it might be something else. Anyway, so we just try to get to shore and then catch a wind shift, and then hopefully pass Amber Sail in front.
We can see a boat there, but we don't know if it's Sailing Poland. Hopefully it is. Yeah, and they're Axel. They're a bit closer now, but we are moving now, so it's good. We need to stay positive and focus on our speed to get that miles.
Thankfully, we've got some good wind at the moment, and it looks like we're going to carry it more or less to the finish. This is still the Mediterranean, so who knows what might happen, and it looks like the weather models really don't understand what's going to happen out there. So for the moment, we're just sailing our course, staying open to all possibilities.
Well, what are those opportunities with the weather for the final few miles into the finish line? And who better to ask than Libby Greenhouse? She's been navigator on board the Ocean Race twice, and she understands the weather systems that a lot of these teams are trying to grapple with. So the big question that I put to her was, where should our focus be?
The sea breezes is what we're going to be looking for, and what we'll see over the next few hours as we go through this afternoon and into the evening is the continuation of that, using the sea breeze, positioning for the headlands, getting the wind bends, and then basically it's all going to be about when the teams choose to move offshore overnight to not get caught in that crossover as the winds die down. because it does look like there's a slight overall going to be an easterly airflow on the larger scale, and so also you're going to be wanting to position offshore but also east of the fleet, such that effectively they're all going to be approaching from probably due south of Genoa, but that's where that initial breeze will come from. But there's going to be a couple of transitions, and there's definitely going to be some flip-flop flapping, and I'm sure some accidental 360s when you have no wind and loose flow, which we've seen a few times already, which is always quite funny to watch on the tracker, though I feel their pain. At the moment, looking at Sailing Poland's position, I think they're in a pretty strong position. They've still got the easterly gauge they need, and so can lead back into the shore to get the last of the sea breeze, and in theory lead the fleet back out on that push offshore. And I think that's the big thing, is basically what they've done really is try to stay in those local shore breezes, but very much keep themselves between the finish line and the pack. Looking at the IMOCAs, they probably with the split have ended up with a big difference between the foilers and the non-foiler there. And looking at Team Offshore Germany doing a great job today of working that shoreline. And I think when I last looked, they had about a 75-mile lead. It has slowly shrunk a little bit. They'll for sure close up, I think, through this afternoon's period. But then I think overnight we'll start to see it probably benefit the team Offshore Germany without their foils, and I would expect them to roll across the line in first place, and I guess in theory win that class.
Libby Greenhow giving us her take on what was going to happen with the Breeze as well as the VO65 class and the IMOCAs. And while she's right that a full 5 points for Offshore Team Germany, if they can keep the lead and take this offshore leg win into Italy, would be fantastic for their chances of taking overall. Don't rule anything out yet. We've still got one more point scoring coastal race, so we could still see the boats behind them. Well, I mean, their lead is diminishing, so we might even see some place changes on the water, but it will certainly keep the overall scoreboard alive. In the VO65, Sailing Poland is going to be pushing pretty hard, but the boats behind them are going to be ready to attack. And with the forecast meaning that we are going to expect a compression, anything is possible in the closing stages of this leg. Keep your eyes glued to the tracker as well as our social media channels for all the latest updates. And as always, we are going to leave you with everything we couldn't fit in today.